The morning Sylvia Voss realized her husband had introduced her to his colleagues as the woman I married. Not by name, not with a smile. She was standing 3 feet behind him at a railway station in the autumn of 1889, holding 2 traveling cases that were not her own. She did not say anything. She had learned, in the 14 months since their wedding, that saying anything rarely changed the shape of a room. His name was Garrett Voss. He was 34 years old, the second son of a wool merchant, who had built himself into something resembling a gentleman, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told he was wrong by anyone whose opinion he valued. He was not cruel. That was the thing people always said about him, and it was true, and it explained almost nothing. The marriage had been arranged in the spring of 1888 by Sylvia's father, Theodore Hale, who was a reasonable man in poor health with 3 daughters and a failing estate outside Stirling. Garrett Voss had money. Sylvia was the eldest. The conversation between the 2 men had lasted approximately 40 minutes, and Sylvia had been informed of the outcome over supper, as though it were news about the weather. She had not protested. She was 23, and she understood the geometry of her situation. What she had not anticipated was the specific texture of her new life. Not the loneliness. She had expected some version of that. But the particular quality of being invisible to a man who slept 4 feet away from her every night. Garrett did not ignore her out of malice. He ignored her the way a person ignores a piece of furniture they have stopped seeing. The chair was there. The chair had always been there. There was no reason to think about the chair. His friends came to dinner on the 2nd Thursday of every month. They were men like him, wool merchants, mill owners, a solicitor named Aldous Webb, who laughed too loudly at his own observations. Sylvia served them, spoke when spoken to, and excused herself at the appropriate time. Once, she heard Garrett through the dining room door. She was not trying to listen. She had come back for a forgotten shawl. Sylvia keeps to herself, he was saying. She's not much for conversation. Quiet sort. Not unpleasant, but, and then a pause and the sound of a glass being set down. Well, she manages the house. She managed the house. She picked up her shawl and went upstairs. It was not the worst thing he had ever said. That distinction belonged to something he had told his mother, Mrs. Voss, during a visit the previous winter. Sylvia had been in the garden, close enough to the window, that the words drifted out to her on the cold air. She is simply not what I imagined, Mother. I expected more. I don't know. More animation. More presence. She is very much a background sort of person, I think. His mother had made a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement, and then the window had been shut. Sylvia had stood very still in the garden for a long time. The ground was frozen. Her boots were inadequate. She thought about the word background. She thought about all the things she had done in the 14 months since the wedding that had required a certain kind of presence. The management of 5 household staff, the repairs she had arranged on the east wing roof before the winter rains, the resolution of a long-standing dispute between their groundskeeper and the family who leased the Voss farmland to the south. She had handled all of it. She had handled it quietly, without announcement, because there had been no one to announce it to. Background, she thought. All right. She went inside and made herself a cup of tea. There was a woman in town named Cecily Marsh who ran a small lending library out of her front room. Sylvia had discovered it in her 3rd week in Hadwick, when she was still learning the shape of the town, still walking its streets with the careful attention of someone studying a map. Cecily was perhaps 40, with ink-stained fingers and a habit of recommending books by pressing them into your hands without explanation. Sylvia had become, without entirely meaning to, Cecily's closest friend. It was Cecily who noticed things. It was Cecily who said, one afternoon in February, without looking up from the book she was cataloging, "You look tired, Sylvia. Not sleep-tired the other kind." Sylvia had thought about denying it. "Yes," she said instead. "Is he unkind to you?" "No, not exactly." Cecily considered this. Sometimes not exactly is the hardest kind. Sylvia did not answer. She looked at the rain on the window for a while. Then she borrowed a novel she had already read and walked home through the wet streets. The spring of 1890 brought 2 things to the Voss household. A letter from Sylvia's father, who was failing faster than expected, and a visit from Garrett's oldest friend, a man named Fletcher Bourne, who arrived from Edinburgh with his new wife and a great deal of energy. Fletcher's wife was called Margaret, bright-eyed, quick with laughter, the kind of woman who asked questions and actually waited for the answers. She and Sylvia walked the grounds on the 2nd afternoon of their visit while their husbands talked business in the study. "You have extraordinary patience," Margaret said, after Sylvia had explained, gently and without complaint, the situation with the South farmland tenants. How long did that negotiation take? 3 months, more or less. Did Garrett know you were managing it? Sylvia looked at the fence line. He knew it was being managed. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I see. Those 2 words, spoken in that tone, were the most honest acknowledgement Sylvia had received in 2 years. Her father died in June. She received the news by post, because Garrett had been invited to a sporting event in Glasgow and she had not wanted to ask him to stay. She read the letter in the kitchen while the housekeeper, Mrs. Dow, pretended to be very busy with something near the window. Mrs. Dow was 60 years old and had worked for the Voss family for 20 of them, and she set a cup of tea in front of Sylvia without being asked and then found somewhere else to be. Sylvia sat with the letter for a long time. She did not cry. She had done most of her crying about her father in advance, in the slow years of watching him diminish, and what she felt now was something more like the particular silence after a bell has stopped ringing. He had been the person who believed she was capable of things. He had told her so, not often but precisely, the way people tell you things they mean. She had been carrying that with her. Now she would carry it alone. Garrett returned from Glasgow 3 days later. He expressed condolences in the way a man expresses condolences when he is not entirely sure what condolences are for. He patted her shoulder. He said he was sorry for her loss. He asked whether she needed anything and, when she said no, appeared relieved. She watched him move through the house that evening. She watched the way he occupied it, fully, easily, without any apparent awareness that there was another person in it with him. She thought about her father's letter. She thought about background. She made a decision, not a dramatic one, not an announcement. It was quieter than that and more final. She would stop, not all at once, but she would begin, systematically, to withdraw the invisible architecture she had been building around this marriage and this household. She would stop anticipating, stop smoothing, stop managing things that had never been credited to her. She would do her own work, her correspondence, her reading, her visits to Cecily, her morning walks, and she would do it without apology and without explanation. And she would wait to see what happened to the house when its invisible structure was removed. It took 4 months for Garrett to notice something was wrong. The first sign was the South farmland. The tenants, a family called Pruitt, had been in low-grade conflict with the estate over a drainage issue for 3 seasons. Sylvia had been the one managing the correspondence, making the compromises, keeping the peace. When she stopped, the letters from Mr. Pruitt began arriving addressed to Mr. Voss. Garrett read the first one with a furrowed brow and set it aside. By the third letter, he was asking Sylvia if she knew anything about a drainage dispute. There was an issue, she said, without elaborating. What sort of issue? The sort that requires someone to correspond regularly with Mr. Pruitt. He waited for her to offer to do it. She looked at him pleasantly and waited for him to understand that she would not. He handled it himself. It took him 4 times as long as it would have taken her, and the resolution was inferior, and the Pruitts were not satisfied. None of this was her fault. She did not say so. The household accounts were next. Sylvia had been managing them for 2 years, reconciling the books monthly, negotiating with suppliers, catching errors that would have compounded quietly into significant problems. When she stopped, the errors began to accumulate. The coal merchant overbilled them in October by a sum that would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. Garrett did not notice until December, when the shortfall appeared in the annual ledger and he could not explain it. He came to find her in the library. "Did you know about the coal merchant?" he said. "I knew there had been some inconsistencies. Why didn't you tell me?" She looked up from her book. "I wasn't certain you'd want to be troubled with household accounts," she said. Her voice was entirely even. He stared at her. She returned to her book. It was not cruelty. She told herself that, and she believed it. She was not doing this to punish him. She was doing it to see. To understand, finally, what she had been contributing to this life, and to let him understand it too. What she had not anticipated was the loneliness of the experiment, the watching and the waiting, and the deliberate smallness of her footprint. She had thought she was used to being invisible, but there was a difference between being unseen and choosing not to be seen, and the second kind cost more. She talked to Cecily, she walked, she read. She wrote long letters to her sister, Adelaide, who had married a schoolteacher in York and seemed, from a distance, genuinely happy. Adelaide wrote back with warmth and without pity, which was exactly what Sylvia needed. In November, Fletcher Bourne came to Hadwick again, alone this time, on business. He came to dinner, and afterward the 2 men sat with their port, and Sylvia excused herself as she always did. She was at the top of the stairs when she heard Garrett say, "I don't know what's happened to her." She used to manage things. Now she just reads, perhaps, Fletcher said mildly. She grew tired of managing things no one thanked her for. There was a silence. Sylvia stood very still on the stair. I thanked her, Garrett said. Did you? Another silence, longer. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to her own breathing. She thought about Fletcher's wife, Margaret, and the way Margaret had said, I see. She thought about her father. She thought about the word background and the word presence, and whether those things were the same or different and whether it mattered. She slept better that night than she had in months. The change in Garrett was not sudden. That was not how men like Garrett changed. It happened the way weather changes, gradually enough that you could almost argue it wasn't happening, and then all at once it was. He began asking her things. Small at first, her opinion on a supplier, her recollection of a conversation from 2 years ago, that he had apparently replayed enough times to want her account of it. Then larger, her thoughts on a proposed expansion of the mill, whether she thought the staff were adequately compensated, what she believed was actually going on with the Pruitt dispute. She answered him. Carefully, honestly, without offering more than he asked. She noticed him listening, the particular stillness of a man who is not waiting for you to finish talking, but actually taking in what you say. It was unfamiliar on his face, and she studied it without letting him see her doing so. In December, she came home from Cecily's to find him in the library. He was standing in front of her bookshelves, her books, the ones she had brought from her father's house, running his finger along the spines. He turned when she came in. He looked for a moment, like a man who had been caught doing something he couldn't quite explain. I didn't realize you'd read all of these, he said. Most of them twice. He looked at the shelves. Then he looked at her. I owe you an apology, he said. She waited. More than one, I think. He seemed to be working through something. I said something. I believe it was last winter, to my mother. You may have heard it, about presents. He paused. I was wrong. I was more wrong than I can account for at the moment, but I wanted you to know that I know it. The room was very quiet. Outside, the December wind was moving through the garden. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Dow was closing shutters against the evening. Sylvia thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the railway station, and the dinner parties, and the morning she had stood in the frozen garden and learned what her husband thought of her. Thank you, she said. Not warmly, not coldly. The way you say something when you mean it and aren't yet sure what to do with it. He nodded. Then, awkwardly, as though this were an entirely new skill he was acquiring in real time, he asked her if she would sit with him for a while. She sat. The rest of the winter was a negotiation, mostly unspoken. Garrett did not transform overnight into something he had never been. He was still, often, a man more comfortable with ledgers than with conversation. He still fell silent at the wrong moments, and spoke at the wrong ones. He still had dinners with Aldous Webb, and Sylvia still excused herself, though now she sometimes did not. And sometimes Garrett looked across the table and caught her eye, and the expression on his face was harder to categorize than it used to be. But he learned her name in a different way. That was the only phrase she could find for it. He had always known it. Now he knew it the way you know the name of something you depend on. With attention, with a kind of belated gratitude that has more weight for being late. In March, they went to Edinburgh for a charity event, hosted by Fletcher and Margaret Bourne. It was a large gathering, the kind Sylvia had dreaded before. Rooms full of people she did not know. Conversations designed more for the impression they made than the content they carried. She stood beside Garrett near the fireplace, and waited for the evening to move around her. A man she had not met approached and extended his hand to Garrett. Voss, he said. Good to see you. And who is this? Garrett turned. He looked at Sylvia. Not the way he had looked at her at the railway station. Not as an afterthought at the end of a sentence. He looked at her directly. This is my wife, he said. Sylvia. She manages our estate outside Hadwick, and she does it better than I ever could. The man looked between them. Sylvia felt something shift in her chest. Not a dramatic thing. Just the particular feeling of a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying being set carefully down. It's a pleasure, she said, and she meant it. Cecily asked her that following spring whether she was happy. Sylvia thought about it for a while. She was standing at Cecily's window, watching the street below where a girl of about 10 was teaching herself to ride a bicycle, falling and starting again with total equanimity. I think I am getting there, she said, slowly, by a route I didn't expect. Cecily made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That's the only honest answer I've ever heard to that question. Sylvia watched the girl on the bicycle steady herself, wobble, and then, for a long and quiet moment, hold her balance.